Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video number 267, Spiritual World as Pseudo-Epicurean in Nature. I want to get into a little bit about my own beliefs because I think I haven't quite differentiated my specific set of beliefs in the philosophical and spiritual sense from Epicureanism, because for a while I considered myself one. But that's only if you look at the more superficial Epicurean beliefs, because I do deviate, but I do derive from that particular mindset, and I think that backdrop is more wise, for instance, than Stoicism. I think it's more wise than most modern philosophies. I believe in Enlightenment philosophy for political reasons, the philosophies of the founders and so forth, the French Revolution, some of these various beliefs, which are kind of malleable even in that time. A lot of times people, they talk about a philosophical school and they act as though it is number one stagnant and number two completely compartmentalized from every other philosophy, that it can't interplay with them, overlap, or be changed. I disagree. So when I look at Epicureanism, the basic gist of it, essentially, is desire is okay, pleasure is good. It is technically a form of hedonism. It's a form of soft, limited, constrained hedonism. I agree with that. Where I differentiate from the Epicurean school, and I don't believe it represents true spirituality, or even true enlightenment, is that the Epicurean says you should try to reduce your indulgence down to the lowest common denominator. So the Epicurean's ultimate goal is to experience maximized happiness by having a loaf of bread and a cup of water. I don't necessarily see that as wise. I see the avoidance of excessive torment and pain is a good thing. Avoidance of pain and fear and anger and so forth are good. Being meditative and at peace, and trying to be appeased by simple things. But that doesn't mean that I go into the realm of the ascetic, which is almost an Epicurean thing. It's funny because basically what's being argued by Epicurus is a form of hedonism that is nonetheless extremely ascetic in nature, to the point where you're basically shunning most worldly attachment and desire, and also because of an atheistic style rejection of the basis of religion and the existence of a deity. Ultimately the idea is to overcome the fear of death, because fear of death, of course, can cause pain in the psychological sense in people's lives. I believe, though, as an apatheist, I don't really care whether there's a deity or a cosmic force or something. I accept the possibility, but I don't really think about it very much because I do not believe it can be proven or disproven and ever will. I do believe in the spiritual. I cannot formulate a spirituality without assuming that there's a uniqueness to life, which begs the question of a continuation of cognition, that there's a purpose to life, essentially, which Epicurus, I believe, would largely reject, or posit the existence of a deity. And since I can't say anything about this deity, nor form an underlying basis to believe that deity or deities or whatever exists, I prefer the former explanation and simply say there is some sort of a spiritual purpose or something beyond the physically mundane. If that is the case, I have no particular underlying reason to believe that life is meant to be rendered to the extremely ascetic, and that there's any real fundamental underlying importance to trying to defeat the fear of death by depriving the pleasure, so to speak, in an artificial manner. So I wouldn't say that you need to get to the point where you're comfortable with just having the clothes on your back and a cup of water, and you can sit there in your cave or whatever and experience maximized pleasure. And of course, they weren't hermetic. I mean, they weren't hermit-like in their nature. They did believe in having friendship and divine love and stuff like that, and Epicurus probably banged hookers and stuff because, people tended to do that a lot back then. So he did enjoy a glass of wine in the company of a fine lady. He just thought that you should generally limit that. You should generally get to the point where the loaf of bread is just as good as the cup of wine, so to speak. I reject the basic underlying premise because I think if you assume that there's only one life to live, you would want to maximize pleasure. The idea of simply reducing your own pleasure drives to a lower denominator does not necessitate that you give up those other sources of pleasure. What causes the pain is excessive desire and excessive satiation of your needs. For instance, the glass of wine, unless you're like diabetic or something, is fine. You become a drunk and you become addicted to the wine and you're spending a lot of money. This requires more work, by the way, which is part of my overlying philosophy. requires more work, can destroy your liver, and so forth, and kill you, can cause all sorts of problems. That is, that the pleasure being indulged in at a low level, the poison, the dose makes the poison. At a low level, a glass or two of wine doesn't fuck you up, is easily obtained. You could even distill your own, potentially. That's the other part. The ease of attaining the desire and the relative safety or not safety of that desire also plays a role. So, and I believe that this carries over into the spiritual realm. I believe that fundamentally, as above, so below, so to speak, and that the eternity beyond is ultimately a reflection of this. If that's a physical continuation, reincarnation, which I believe in, life will tend to arise where conditions are good for life. Life will tend to compete. It'll probably be, if there are alien races out there, I hate to tell you, they're probably warlike, at least in an exterior sense, towards other species. They're highly competitive. Things will evolve. Things will seek homeostasis. They'll seek to consume matter and absorb energy in such a way as to maintain themselves. They will replicate. These things are innate. That is, that the reflection of the rest of your existence in the physical sense, assuming there is a continuation, would be like this. Why then would you, if the Epicurean philosophy therefore were developed everywhere and promulgated universe-wide, you would live a series of lives in which things would be a little bit on the dull side, potentially. And you wouldn't always necessarily come about in a place where you could live that sort of life anyway. You might end up incarnating as some sort of life form that needs excess to some extent. Needs, in order to survive, it has to absorb this jelly from this rocky coast here, and the jelly makes it high as motherfucker, and it has to continue eating it, otherwise it'll die. Well, you're going to spend a lot of time intoxicated and hallucinating as you glorp down your coastal rock jelly or whatever. There's probably a world like that out there, by the way, in the infinite universes that exist. I believe in the multiverse, or at least the infiniteness of space. If there's a spiritual continuation, it begs the question of why you would live one physical mundane life and then everything else is spiritual. Now, some people in Eastern philosophies would say, well, the physical is sort of a fallen and corrupted a reflection of the spiritual world. Well, again, why would billions of years of evolution in this process then compensate for it by continuously enslaving things to sensual pleasures which would be spiritual harmful? I don't believe that that would be the case. I believe that those pleasures are fundamentally good. The Epicurean says, therefore, limit your pleasures to things that you can always obtain. I say limit your pleasures to things that are reasonably easy to maintain and obtain. So, for instance, if I want to garden, feel sunshine on my shoulders, and walk around with a Budweiser or something, that's simple pleasure, by and large. It's easily obtained. It's productive as well. It's fun. It's entertaining and rewarding, I believe. And I think there's nothing more spiritual than gardening, by the way. You become godlike. You're determining where a species is going to spend the rest of its life. You're responsible for whether it lives and dies, lives well and thrives, or suffers, essentially. It suffers and withers on the vine. There's nothing more strictly godlike than the gardening. And architecture, ironically. And maybe a Masonic statement there. But what I would avoid is excessive pleasure in the sense of, and I use the anecdote about people who are into like fast cars and casinos and stuff. If you were to have, as the world does frequently, might be seeing the dawn of that right now, unfortunately, a depression, severe downturn, a time of turmoil, it's going to be a lot more goddamn difficult to live that kind of a lifestyle. Whereas the person who just wants to be left alone in their garden and swill down a couple of Budweisers, they can still do that. Budweisers might cost more. Maybe they have to switch to a locally produced microbrew or something because maybe large beer corporations go out of business. By the way, seeds and gardening supplies and alcohol, always very popular at times of international crises. So, plan accordingly in your lifestyle, maybe. I prefer to think that it's better to be simply able to live below your means, for pragmatic reasons only, number one, and live well and enjoy yourself and try to be generally calm about things. As far as the fear of death being overcome, I see it as innate that life forms will automatically have some fear of mortality because their biological drive alone is telling them to maintain their life and continue reproducing. And it will always do that. When a person is, they might get worn down and stuff, and they're like, fuck it, basically, and they're just exhausted and sort of ready to go. By and large, though, I do believe death is fundamentally a fearful thing for biological reasons. There's really nothing you can do to get around it. It's more about living a good life, having things that are positive to think of when you're dying on your deathbed, and trying to avoid regrets. Try to avoid things that would make you feel psychologically guilty in your last moments. Oh shit, I lived a shitty life and I'm dying. Fuck. I think that's probably a bad way to go. I think I'd rather die traumatically without regret than die, surrounded by love and peaceful in bed and stuff and have all sorts of terrible things to think about in my last moments. I think I'd rather get my head chopped off in a war knowing that I had lived a good life. Because in those last moments, at least I'm like, maybe I go to Valhalla or something. And that's the other possibility. If there is some sort of a weird afterlife sort of thing, there's no reason to crucify the flesh. If you look at most of the religions posited throughout mankind's history, the idea of withholding from certain behaviors certainly is something that you find, but the idea of withholding from all pleasure is really a kind of a warped concept that doesn't really make a lot of biological sense or spiritual sense. I prefer the bravery religions like the Norse system or something, where the whole goal, yes, you should celebrate and drink mead, but you should have something to celebrate about. Make more children, make the next generation, crush your enemies, try to build a good longhouse and stuff, catch big fish, have adventures. That's good, fundamentally. The idea of maybe the classical religions where philosophy was sort of enshrined, and they're like, well, exercise your mind, maintain a reasonable, disposition in your body, try to live a good life and be noble. I think those are good things. The idea that you have to lock yourself away in a monastery and you're not allowed to have any rich foods. You'll survive on just rough bread and water, and on Christmas you're allowed to have a sip of wine or something. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. What if you find at the end of your life that there's nothing beyond that? Well, you haven't even enjoyed all the pleasures of the one life you had to live. If hardline atheism is true, you should be a hedonist. But you should be a reasonable hedonist, because otherwise you might suffer more. That's it in a nutshell. And I believe that the spiritual world, in all of its forms, will necessarily conform to the same idea, because if as above, so below, as below, so above. Look at the physical world around you, look at the odd logical paradoxes we have to grapple with, and you can make statements about the spiritual. This is a pretty die-hard esoteric concept that a lot of people don't seem to understand, which is really funny. They think, well, the world is a reflection of the skies above. Well, it works in reverse. It has to. One would be a reflection of the other. Your reflection isn't magically transmogrified from the other side. It's a reflection. It's just an image of the same thing, mirrored, roughly. That's about all. Peace out.